Hello, good evening, everyone. Welcome to today's panel discussion, Art and Science Practices on Svalbard. This event is part of the Convergence Artistic Explorations from Nature to Society exhibition, supported by the National Science and Technology Council. I am Paige, the exhibition curator, and it's my great honor to introduce this remarkable discussion. This discussion starts with the science and art practices in the Svalbard Islands, a crucial site for simulating extreme space climates. However, through the diverse perspective of our speakers today, we hope to foster a dialogue that can lead to even broader possibilities for interdisciplinary collaboration. And first, thank you all for joining us online today. If you have any questions during the discussion, please type them in the chat room. We will reserve time for audience questions towards the end of the session. You can now pin our panelists with the exhibition's visual background to fix them on your screen. Second, I want to introduce the exhibition Convergence. It's supported by National Science and Technology Council in Taiwan, and it typically is seen as a platform for gathering Taiwan's researchers and scientific professionals. This initiative aims to expand the horizons of scientific research by integrating artistic perspectives, or vice versa, encouraging a more holistic approach to understanding and innovation. I am delighted to introduce our moderator for today, Maggie Coblentz. Maggie is a researcher and artist and the founder of Fieldscape, a platform that unites artists, scientists, and fieldwork practitioners dedicated to environmental exploration and storytelling. Maggie has also led field logistics and production for the NIT Media Lab, the NIT Space Exploration Initiative, and international researchers specializing in Arctic-based projects. I have worked with Maggie since my time at NIT, where we collaborated on various projects, including the zero-gravity flights and speculative art projects. Maggie's work, which spans fashion, food, and design to explore human aspects in space exploration, has always fascinated and inspired me. I also want to thank our esteemed panelists for being here and sharing their invaluable insight. Maggie, thank you for being with us today. I am excited to hear the findings and experiences that our panelists will share.
Thank you so much, Pao, for this introduction and also for inviting all of us today to share our work and have this conversation. My research explores this intersection of art and science, which is precisely why we're here today. And I work to uncover how these disciplines both inform and inspire one another. While I've never confined myself to the boundaries of any of these specific fields, I recognize, and I think we all recognize, the challenges that some face in fully grasping both art or science or all of the myriad of fields that exists in research. So to give a little bit of background first for this conversation, Svalbard is an archipelago in the Arctic Ocean between mainland Norway and the North Pole. It has a long history and current activities of exploration, mining, tourism, science, art, and today it's also a home for almost 2,500 people, as well as diverse plants and animals, which is why it's such an exciting place for people to be to learn about the environment. And this unique environment continues to inspire many international researchers such as us, including artists and scientists who are each bringing their own motivations, methodologies, ideologies, audiences, and even funding sources. So today we're going to discuss this relationship between art and science, and particularly within the context of environmental change and in projects in Svalbard. So without further ado, I'll now introduce our speakers and our panelists today, who will go on to share their own insights and experiences on this topic and a little bit of background about their projects in Svalbard before we launch into a conversation. So first we have Dr. Jacek Chang, who is an assistant professor at the Department of Earth Sciences at the National Central University in Taiwan, with experience towards structural geology, geomorphology, neotectonics, and field training. We have Patrick Chwalek, who is a PhD candidate at the MIT Media Lab and also affiliated with the National Geographic Exploration Technology Lab. His recent work specializes in creating devices that capture data in natural and extreme environments, such as the remote regions of Patagonia to find endangered bee species, or on African wild dogs in Botswana. Dr. Cody Paige is the director of the MIT Space Exploration Initiative and a National Geographic explorer. Cody is an engineer and geologist passionate about STEAM education. And today, Cody works on how we can see virtual reality to explore the lunar surface. Finally, we have Shure and Nancy Valladares, who are members of Lythologies, a decentralized network of interdisciplinary artists and practitioners, some of whom met at MIT. They often come together to work on exhibitions, films, and other collaborative works. Ray and Nancy teach at the New School and NYU.
Yeah, I'm happy to start us off and very excited to be here today. I love the conversation about combining art and science. I think it's a very important one. Maggie, thank you for the great introduction. I guess I don't have to repeat very much here. I am the director of the Space Exploration Initiative. We're part of the Media Lab at MIT, and we work on maturing student projects, research, and experiments to put them into space. And we really think about not just technology, but the culture and how we want to bring that culture into space with us. So this collaboration between artists and researchers is a very big part of what we do at the Space Exploration Initiative. Today, I'm going to be talking to you about my work there and the research I'm doing, which is called Capturing the Moon. This is work that's being done as part of a lunar mission. So we're actually going to the surface of the moon, the South Pole, at the beginning of 2025, so coming up very quickly. And a big part of preparing for this is doing testing here on Earth. So this project focuses on a LiDAR camera, which is a camera that takes 3D images, and how we can test that here on Earth to prepare for this South Pole mission. So next slide. One of the places that we got to test this camera was in Svalbard. It's in the Arctic. It has really very extreme looking environments. So this is an environment where there are not a lot of plants that grow. There are definitely no trees. Everything is very open and exposed. And so it's a beautiful landscape to go and get to explore, but also the perfect place to be able to test this camera and capture data that will be representative of what we might see in space. Next slide. This is some of the work that we did to collect the data. We had to prepare for the environment ourselves. So dress very warm and make sure that our batteries would last. We had all of this gear that we had to bring out into the field with us. And I took a lot of notes about what I was seeing myself. We also did different tests to see how this camera would work in the field, how we'd actually want to collect the data, different routes that we'd want to take to make sure that we got 3D images that really told the story of what we were seeing in the field. But what this also did for us was allowed us to explore this really unique environment that is incredibly fragile and has a lot of wildlife that you don't even expect to be there, a lot of really interesting geology, and a lot of people, which was really unexpected. So going into this, I didn't think that we would really see many people at all. I didn't realize how many people live and thrive in this place. and how many artists there were. We got to speak to a lot of artists in the community. And so being able to do all this data collection in this really unique environment really brought me back to Earth as well. So yes, I'm testing something for space, but I also got to understand our planet better and the people who live here as well. And next slide. So part of this project then is really to understand how we can translate this information that we're seeing here on Earth about this really incredible environment, how we can translate that into space. So what we're doing is taking this 3D data and putting it into a virtual environment that people can explore. So again, we're bringing people back into the story. How can we allow people to explore space without having gone there? There are not a lot of people that have ever been to space, not a lot of people that are going to get to go and explore the moon or eventually Mars. And so how do we make sure that all of humanity gets to go? And part of that is going to be using virtual reality. So here you can see on the top part, that's the images that we took from Svalbard. This is a very unique permafrost feature that tells us that there's water beneath the surface. And we took that in virtual reality and we changed it so that it looks a bit like what you would see on Mars. So here we can help people to understand that there are features that we see here on Earth. There are the same features on Mars. And so you can see kind of what that change looks like. Next slide. This is a video of some of the work that we did. This is another location that was in an area where a glacier had retreated. And so again, all that water, thinking about glaciers, we really think of that as an Earth feature. But these locations also exist on Mars. There are glaciers on Mars and they have retreated, and we want to understand what that means for the environment, what that means for the environment on Earth, and how we can kind of tell the difference. And so we use different tools in the environment. You can just see in the background there, there's a little floating number, that white space, and here we go coming towards it. And that tells us about the temperature that's there, the humidity, and the pressure. So a little bit about the environment. Of course, that's coming from Svalbard. But we can also change this then to look like what it would be on Mars. And we can get an understanding of the differences between the two. And here we are on Mars now. So we've changed the coloring in the background. And we can get a better kind of communication between Earth and space by using tools. So what does this mean now for our project? We're coming all the way back now to what I first mentioned, that we're going to the moon. So we have this little camera, and you can see it on the front of the rover there. That's a Lunar Outpost rover. So our little camera is going to be on the front of that, capturing this 3D data. So now we have to take all of the information that we learned in Svalbard and translate that to this mission of what we're going to be doing on the lunar surface. And hopefully, one day soon, we will have virtual environments of the lunar surface, of those real 3D images, that all of you can come to the moon with us as well.
Thank you so much, Cody. Patrick Chwalek, we can have you share your slides now and present your work, please.
Hi, everyone. So I'm Patrick. I am a PhD candidate at the MIT Media Lab within the Responsive Environments group. So within my group, we do a lot of hardware design and for different applications as well. So for space, we collaborate a lot with Cody and her team, but we also work on other things as well, such as putting sensors on people, so wearables or sensors near people, and for animal applications as well. And then for underwater applications and for a lot of other things, such as supporting conservation efforts, et cetera, et cetera. So if you look at the history of our group, we've done a lot of different kind of hardware deployments. And as far as my background, I, as many people at the Media Lab, I have a pretty varied background, but I do a lot of wearables, both for people, so smart glasses, which you could see here, but also I do, or as of the last 2 years, I've been working a lot with animals. So this has been in partnership with National Geographic, specifically their Exploration Technology Lab. But we work a lot with endangered bumblebees in Patagonia, African wild dogs in Botswana, and guardian frogs in Borneo. But the devices that I build for them for these applications with their explorers are designed to be used for other applications as well. So I'm essentially building tools for their explorers, as well as other conservationists and ecologists to use to kind of support their effort, because oftentimes When you want to go analyze something in the field, you try to use something commercial, and it might not be the exact right thing that you want to use, but it's the only thing that's available. So I'm trying to create a set of tools that is a bit more flexible for different applications. Next slide. And so what brought me to Svalbard actually is this idea of immersive experiences. So kind of what Cody was just showing you in the last slide deck. She built this whole VR environment of Mars. And what's really interesting is that what if, or what's more interesting for me is like, what is the technology that would enable somebody to build something like that, right? And you could also think about that a bit more as if you want to create a museum exhibition, how do you kind of structure the data to make people feel as if they're in these environments which are difficult for them to actually physically experience, right? So Svalbard is one of them. Remote regions in Argentina is another environment that I've been in. How can we have people feel like they're there, experience the nature, understand why conservation efforts in these areas are important, because this will actually fuel the science and the missions to do this kind of work. Next slide. And so for Svalbard, the thing that I was really interested in at that time was how we could capture immersive audio. So I'm sure if a few of you have heard spatial audio, or at least that term, over the last few years, but it's a way of feeling as if you're in an environment, and then you could project sounds into your headphones or into various speakers in the room to kind of design the experience as if the sounds are coming from specific locations in the room. So that kind of increases the immersion effect of an experience. And so what I wanted to do is create a set of tools that we could take and experiment in Svalbard to capture all the different sounds in the space, especially of all the various biodiversity that's there, especially all the different kind of bird species that that nest there over the summer months. So I built this system called Sound Shroom. It looks like a little mushroom. A lot of the locals made a lot of comments about, or were really curious about what these little orange things were in the distance. So that kind of really influenced the name. But it's a device that has 10 microphones that all capture audio synchronously. And then what then you could do is, since you have all these synchronized audio channels, you could then get a better understanding of where the sound is in a 3D space, so that if you have that, you could then create an experience that projects that sound in those locations, and then makes the audience feel as if they're actually there, or if a bird is flying towards you and past you, or other things kind of like that that require more spatial awareness. Next slide. So here you could see that we deployed this system in Svalbard. You could see on the left image, it was surrounded by a lot of Arctic geese. But the idea there during our 10-day trip there is to deploy this sensor in as many locations as we can across Svalbard to capture as much of the diversity as we can. Next slide. And so what we did is we deployed it over 6 different locations, many of them along Advendalen Valley, and one of them on a glacier that was nearby the local town. But we captured over, I think it was over like 200 hours of 10-channel audio. So there's a lot of audio, and this audio we made available to other scientists, such as the people studying bird sounds at Cornell, because this repository of data really never existed before in this very remote location. So this is kind of fueling their machine learning efforts there, but it's also really interesting for us here because we're able to analyze the data, play around with localization at the lab for artistic projects, and really just show people the wealth of like the biodiversity within Svalbard that don't really understand that there could even be a bird species in the Arctic nesting. It's a new kind of, it's really interesting when you kind of show people the audio and they're just kind of blown away by it. Next slide. And then we tested a few different things in Svalbard as well. One thing about bioacoustic or wildlife recordings is that wind is always the worst enemy. And so what you do for microphones is you add different materials over your microphones, such as these fluffy things that you see in the picture, to help dampen that wind noise as well. So all the different sound streams that we had throughout the space had different kind of fuzzy material on it, which of course led to other comments by people that didn't really understand what we were doing, because it was a very like interesting kind of looking thing. Next slide. And here is a sample recording that we recorded. We'll just play the first 30 seconds of it, but to kind of get an understanding of the sounds that we captured. I think the sounds are a little quiet on Zoom, but we could send the hyperlink after. But we have many hours of this data. So if there are any people that are studying birds out there and want access to it, let us know. We all have it accessible on the cloud. And then I'll finish off by saying that so a lot of the work in Svalbard has enabled other projects since then, since it's been about a year since we visited. And so one of them is studying bees in Patagonia. And so we built a new type of acoustic system that has been influenced by the data and our experiences in Svalbard, that allow us to capture high-resolution audio of endangered bee species in remote regions of Patagonia. And then hopefully we will be able to use this new system again back in Svalbard. And that's it.
Thank you, Patrick. So exciting to hear about. We'll move on to Lythologies with Nancy Valladares and Shure.
Thank you, Maggie. So I'll start off our presentation. Hi, everyone. We're Lythologies. We're a decentralized research group, and we're interested in climate futures, food sovereignty, and the slippery edges of extreme environments. We like to say that we're friends who practice in extreme environments. I'm Ray, and I'll introduce our project, Stories Written by the Sky. And Nancy will talk about our expedition to Svalbard and how that shaped our project. So our collaboration began with the project titled 3,000 Years Among Microbes, which is currently in this show right now. In 3,000 years, we explored the history of non-human space travelers and the current landscape of space colonization. It served as a kind of prologue to this current project, which is a transmedia project that explores climate imaginaries that emerge in the Arctic region. So this project began as an interactive film that evolved into a larger pedagogical project in which we explore the Arctic as a chronograph, or a kind of timekeeper in climate narratives. Next slide, please. Here are some screenshots from our filming in Svalbard. And through the choice of this immersive choice-based narrative film, which is essentially a kind of game, or a machinima, which is a combination of two words, machine and cinema, we hope to bring the audience into other kinds of temporalities. So we built storylines and filmed on sites that converge these strange temporalities, such as the global seed vault, which signifies a kind of latent time, or an after the apocalyptic end of times, or the last remaining coal mine in Svalbard, which points to a kind of temporal theft or stolen time. Next slide, please. And this is our initial taxonomy of temporalities that structured our storylines. And after our expedition to Svalbard, and thanks to all the people that we met, we learned about many different kinds of other kinds of time. And Nancy will share more about that.
Thank you so much, Ray. Could we move to the next slide, please? Thank you so much. Yes, I'm going to talk a little bit about, I guess, how we approach our time in Svalbard. It was definitely a very brief but really interesting exercise in trying to balance work, being in community, but also to get to know a place in a really short amount of time. We were only there, I believe, for 7 days total. But the way that we decided to approach this trip was to think about a central question, which was essentially, what are people's individual relationship to time, and how does it differ in Svalbard? And as you can see in this slide, we have some documentation of some workshops that were held. One of them who was led by experimental pastry chef Ethan Kahn at Arctica. And the workshop was based on and paid homage to the symbolism of the seeds in the global seed vault. But simultaneously, we also asked our participants to help us ideate and think about their relationships to time. So in the bottom right, you can actually see some of the remnants of the food and the workshop that was sort of like happening, while at the same time, people and participants were answering prompts that encouraged the participants to think about their particular relationship to time and how it changed when they were in a place like Svalbard, where half of the year is constituted by the midnight sun and the other half is the polar night, which means that like the way that people count time or experience their relationship to temporal structures is very, very different. Could we go to the next slide, please? So to the right, you can actually see some of the sketches. These are from Zinnia and Sasha, in which like people were sort of like making drawings that talked about how those like temporal structures were different to them. And these stories and anecdotes that were collected during our time in Svalbard are kind of forming the basis for the storylines in the film, but also eventually will become this publication that we hope to also return to the community during the time that we were there. And so in our, I guess, like experience as observers and as people who came to experience a place as a visitor, it was really important for us to approach our relationship, I guess, to this place and which is with as much reciprocity as possible. And so the format of the workshop, I think, was really important, and I think it's turned out to be a very successful approach at the end of the trip. But so far, that's basically the end of our kind of brief introduction to our presentation. So I'll just hand it over to Maggie again.
Thank you, Ray and Nancy. I believe that might be it for the presentations at the moment. So thank you everyone for sharing your work, and now we can launch into a discussion. I will kick it off with a question for each individual and artist group in the case of Lythologies, but I hope that it will be more conversational. So to all of the panelists, please feel free to also chime in on the respective questions. And then after that, we can open it up to our audience for a Q&A discussion as a group as well. So I will start with Cody. The question for you is, how have your experiences collaborating across these disciplines, as you are very much working with both artists and scientists, enriched your creative process and or your scientific process, just your research process in general? And could you maybe share an example of a project where the involvement of artists has enhanced the outcomes or insights gained by a scientific team?
Yeah. So this question really hits home for me. My mom is actually an artist, so I really feel passionate about having artists be involved in the research that I do, and making sure even that the way I think kind of leans towards the artistic side as well. I love to incorporate that into my work. And this working in Svalbard really, I think, opened up that availability for this work and these projects as well. So I started this actually as a PhD student and working in Svalbard. So there's a kind of two aspects to this kind of collaboration with artists. The first one is very technical. So working in Svalbard, we're collecting all this data, and it's really incredible data. It's really beautiful 3D images of a very unique environment. But when you put that into a virtual environment, it sort of just looks like this very island, not connected space. And so you need to have a creative aspect to be able to put it into a complete environment so that when you're standing in that small patch of 3D imagery, that the rest of what you're seeing doesn't just look like blank space. And so we actually needed to pull in artists and designers to be able to make this look like a space that felt like Svalbard and wasn't just this island patch of data. And so that's something that we've been experiencing along the entire route of this development work in virtual reality, is that it's critical that we have artists and designers to make this look and feel like the space that we want it to be. And moving into the lunar environment now, we actually don't have the data yet. The mission hasn't happened. And so we have to create this virtual environment entirely from images that have been taken from other missions and kind of the conceptual vision of what the lunar surface looks like. And so everything you saw on that last slide of my presentation was actually done by an artist and designer. He's also an engineer, but again, really focuses on his artistic components, his artistic side for this work. And it's an entirely artistic rendering. So really important to have artists in this work that we're doing. But then the other side of it is less kind of on the technical side, but more on how we actually think about the work. And that was really impactful in Svalbard. So while I was there, I got to visit with you, the Artist Collective. That's a really unique thing in Svalbard, that there's so much focus on art. This is a really beautiful environment and really does inspire artistic endeavors for a lot of people. And I think that's why artists are drawn to that location and why there's so much focus on art in Svalbard. But for me, being able to see all of these incredible projects that these artists are doing in Svalbard, I think it really brought back the cultural component of being in these environments. And so as scientists, we often call these harsh environments when we're visiting them. And I think that term for me kind of, all of a sudden I was a little taken aback by it. It was like, and this was a conversation you and I had while we were there, was that when we call them harsh environments, it makes people think that there's no culture or humanity or beauty in these spaces, but instead we think of them as almost scary. And so instead, thinking, yes, they are extreme, but the cultures that develop there are so unique and beautiful. And so Svalbard really opened that up for me. And I feel like now when I do these expeditions, I think of the culture as a huge component of that expedition as well.
Thank you so much, Cody. Just as a follow-up to that, because not only have we been working in Svalbard together, but also recent field work in Lanzarote as a follow-up to your work and with your larger lab that you run, MIT Space Exploration Initiative. And as a geologist by training, I was so amazed to see some of the methods that you use. So I wanted to talk a little bit about how maybe an artistic lens also had you thinking differently about your research methodologies. Some of the sketches that we were doing in our field notebooks of the landscapes, and then working with other artists such as Chucho Ocampo, how that might have not only impacted the outcome of the work, but actually the process through which we are collecting and our data in situ.
Yeah. So geologists, it's interesting. Actually, it's almost like art is incorporated into geology, because a lot of what we do is these sketches. So it's all about representing what you're seeing on paper and being able to draw and kind of think about the environment that you're seeing. And so, yeah, it does influence it. And when we were in the Canary Islands, so starting out that expedition, we wanted to make sure that we brought an artist with us, because it changes the lens of the research. And so having Chucho there, I think, made us all kind of see the landscape and see the environment in a different light. We were all looking at it from a very artistic lens because of what he brought to the group. So I think that's critical was to have him there, but also being able to think of it in that different light and capturing the data. Yeah, you start thinking about it more holistically, I guess, kind of thinking about the entire picture and how you want to represent that. So the art really comes into the research.
Yeah, I think for me, my experience as a non-scientist, also being introduced to the world of science through these various expeditions, I always thought of the methods of scientists as being hard fact, when in fact there's so much subjectivity and ability for you to put yourself into that work. So seeing you as a geologist and scientist drawing in your notebook, it felt like, actually, as you said, this is already an artistic method. It just has this other label on it. So you start to kind of break that down within these different fields. It's quite interesting.
And builds a connection too, I think, to the environment. Like, it builds a better connection when you're when you're putting yourself into it. It's, you know, you think about it differently.
Right. Thank you. Patrick, how do you find this balance between both creative expression and then also scientific accuracy when communicating discoveries through art? You talked about this a little bit with Sound Shroom already and its various outputs.
Yeah, that is a tough question, because I feel like if you would have asked me that 6 years ago when I first started at the Media Lab, and now my answers would be totally different. So I'm an engineer first in terms of my professional background, so mechanical engineering, computer science, electrical engineering. And at the Media Lab, I'm surrounded by artists and creative minds, right? So when I was first starting, it was a whole new world, right? Because the way that artists think it's a little different than how engineers think as well, and how art projects are kind of executed. And so I always kind of grew up being fairly creative, but I've been always interested in engineering. And I think that it really depends on how you're kind of really balancing, you know, the arts and the sciences. And so if you're publishing, obviously, like an academic journal, you wouldn't necessarily want to abstract that in any way, because honestly, traditional engineers, they don't really understand art as well, or they don't really appreciate it, especially in journals. One example is today, I was reading an article how a lot of paleontologists are upset that museums are using AI-generated images to show the public how dinosaurs might look like. You know, it's not accurate. It's interesting, it's provocative, but they are actually upset with the lack of accuracy. So that's kind of the things that we're struggling with, right? So it really depends on the venue. But as I was telling the audience what brought me to Svalbard, it's really about immersion. It's really about engaging the audience and showing them the value of these very unique, sensitive environments. And even though we can't go there, or we shouldn't go there, showing them what these environments kind of look like, feel like, right? And so, you know, it's kind of like, if anybody has ever seen Planet Earth or anything similar to that, it's a very like high definition, you know, it's not like fully immersive. You're not in VR, but like you see all these animals and these creatures, and the narrative that kind of shapes the whole story, it just engages you, and it really makes you appreciate, you know, the beauty of wildlife and our world. And I think there's a lot of that needs to kind of get leveraged in science, right? So if I'm building a system, so for instance, a lot of explorers, they like to procure any kind of instruments that they can, that's not too expensive, and take it out in the wild to get recordings. Let's say like audio recordings. Those recordings might not be the best recordings. Like those aren't the recordings that like a director like James Cameron would use, right? Like recorders, but it's enough to fulfill the scientific question. However, if you're going out to these very remote areas, which are already expensive to get to, you should try to take the best kind of instruments that you can that can also create these art installations, museum exhibits, things like that. And that's kind of where I am. I'm at the cross section between, you know, what Nat Geo funded scientists want to do, but also what the Disney arm of Nat Geo wants, right? They want to build these immersive exhibits, engage the audience, and help fund all these efforts for science. So you kind of have to leverage both things. And It was also really fascinating for our Svalbard trip, for instance. So, you know, me as an engineer, but we also had a couple artists and designers there with us. And it was really interesting because, like, you know, every evening and at lunch, Maggie helped plan these elaborate dinners, which were amazing. And I still dream about them. But we kind of sat there and just discussed all these different kind of topics. We kind of exchanged ideas. Some of them were weird, some of them were practical. But this kind of helped shape, you know, the projects, our findings, the things that we did afterwards. Even the name of Soundstream came out of a workshop dinner that we did on the name. So I think there's a lot of value in blending art with science. It really depends on the context. You know, again, academic journals, not so much, but installations or museum exhibits, or even just talking to you guys. It's you kind of have to blend it a bit more, because if I just show you the graphs of the data and don't show you like don't really explain it or really craft the narrative behind the science, then it's not as engaging and you might not care as much, and it might be something you might scroll right past if you were shown this on social media. But so it's really about engagement and increasing that while preserving scientific integrity.
Thanks, Patrick. When we were in Svalbard with this group of artists and designers, you just made me think back to this time. We had your project, which had quite specific research methods because you were looking for a particular wildlife. So we knew that we were going to go into Advendalen, for example. We had to install your equipment for a certain amount of time to have a rigorous scientific study, whereas some of the artists and designers and other researchers with us didn't necessarily have a method. So they were there to create a method or to look for a place of interest. And at times this created actually a little bit of tension within the group to sort of which project would get prioritized, how would we spend our time, what was most valuable. So I was just curious if you had any thoughts on that, working with interdisciplinary groups in the future as something to maybe manage a little bit better, set expectations for that.
Yeah. Patience is key, I think, in all of this. You know, it's difficult bringing in a lot of different personalities and a lot of different expertises, and some of them are going to be very structured and like, this is my document of all the things I want to do. I want to stick to this document, versus somebody else might come in and be like, I don't really know what I'm going to do. I don't really know what it's going to be. I just want to go and experience this and kind of in real time converge on an idea. And it might not be perfect, it might not be as structured, but eventually it's going to come and be something, right? There's a lot of risk associated with that, and I think a lot of engineers like to limit risk, right? So it's like opposing forces, and I really do think it's a lot of patience, but also appreciation for the arts, right? Because the thing is, a lot of creative minds kind of go with the flow and really come up with ideas as it comes. But if you're too rigid as an engineer, then you don't really appreciate, you know, these experiences that you're kind of missing out on as well. And so, like for our trip, for instance, yes, it was tense at times, but I think for the most part, we really got some really interesting output out of it that we wouldn't get otherwise. And we tried a couple different things for the more artistic-minded people that were with us that didn't quite work. But you know, but we experienced it. We grew closer as a team, and we still generated content and material for that. And at the same time, we left that trip with a lot of different data that we wouldn't have had otherwise. And I also remember that there was a point in the trip where we had one of the geologists with us who were, after we hiked up one of the glaciers, we all kind of sat there and she taught us how to kind of sketch out on a piece of paper these various geological landmarks and things. So we kind of also learned from that as well. So I think, again, patience is key, but there's a lot of beautiful things that can happen with when you bring all these different kind of disciplines together. And it will be frustrating, but I think it's very valuable for everybody. And this kind of also speaks to my experience at the Media Lab. I'm surrounded by artists, designers, architects, like pretty much all disciplines. And I think having patience, having appreciation for all the different fields and kind of working together, it's very important. And that's why the Media Lab, in my eyes, is such a unique microcosm of, it's just a very interesting place that you really don't find in many other places.
Yeah, I think it can be quite challenging, especially when, as you said, if it's the outcome is engineering based and there's funding that is driving the project, and so there needs to be a deliverable, and there's so much pressure on having this outcome, and the artist can often remain elusive. And even though the methodologies and also what someone else might view as a failure or not producing a result, maybe those results come 5 years later and just have a different shape and form. So trying to find more shared language so that there's more understanding and patience for people who aren't quite as open as you, who's used to this environment.
Exactly.
This question is both for Ray and Nancy. How do your research methods, speaking of research methods of artists, and you have also been at MIT and are familiar with this interdisciplinary environment through your work as well, how do your methods differ from those who are employed by scientists, or sorry, those methods employed by scientists, and where do you see the overlap for or synergy?
I'm going to start answering the first half of the question. I do think that in some way, both artists and scientists are by this desire to get a closer look to the unknown. And they have sometimes these kind of deeply speculative approaches or practices, which start by asking questions. And there are, again, many ways of thing art and our methods to science with many divergences and convergences, but I think it's always really important, or like also just interesting, to talk about the historical and ideological split that occurred between these fields, which occurred around the time of the Enlightenment. And sometimes it's interesting that we try to kind of like make these connections that historically have already been there between the arts and the sciences. So it sometimes occurs like a wave, like we get closer to one another and then they kind of seem to split and get closer to one another. So I would actually like argue that synergy is inherent to both of these fields. Before there was like this kind of distinction between the artist and the scientist, they were actually often one and the same practitioner. The first instance that we have the word scientist to ever be used was actually in 1834, which was a term that was coined by Reverend William Whewell, who was like a English polymath, and it was a hybrid term that was from the Latin word scientia. Whereas in the same paragraph, he also quoted the analog, like the artist, that's also terminology. And by scientist, like the term scientist as a practitioner, that's what I mean, the emergence of this kind of term. Whereas the artist has existed, like a little bit, beforehand. And then this kind of biological split happened. So in many ways, I actually think that there's this, there are ebbs and flows, and in many ways, methods I think are different. But I do think that they are many ways almost like siblings or two sides of one same coin.
Thank you, Nancy. I think it's worth mentioning again that there are many different types of artists and also many different types of scientists who do art and science differently. And so speaking to our own experience, we would situate ourselves in the field of interdisciplinary art. And within this field, artists often take on the role of researchers. But I would say like a general difference between scientific researchers and artistic researchers is that scientific researchers are looking for new answers, while artistic researchers are looking for new questions, in a very broad stroke. But as artists, we want to always be asking, is there another way to understand something? And through this kind of asking to look for productive frictions, and at the same time to mirror pressing issues in the world. But it's all a feedback loop, like new answers lead to new questions and vice versa. And that's where I see like the really productive synergy happening between art and science, and why it's so valuable to have these different kinds of perspectives in the same space, always like giving each other feedback and leading into new synergies and producing new ways of looking at the world. Like basically we are just modeling the world in different ways. And even though our models can look different, collectively, all these different types of models lead to a more comprehensive way of engaging with this world around us.
Thank you so much, Ray and Nancy. I think it's such a good point that you raise about the diversity of both the artists and the scientists. First of all, that there's not a one catch-all for what is a scientist and what is an artist, but also the expectation setting. And I think so often artists get put in this position of being a science communicator within the context of science, which was not necessarily their goal. And in your case, as researchers, asking the question in an interesting way is so critical. And I think that's why I was asking Patrick also and Cody about how might the artists also have influenced their methods in addition to the final outcome. It's exciting possibility. I'd love now to open it up to all of our panelists to speak to one another. Maybe before we open it up to the entire floor, and no pressure, but if there are specific questions you have for one another to maybe probe or challenge, or just about their work, and otherwise we can all talk. I've seen already a few questions come into the chat from the audience, so thank you for that. We also already know each other, so perhaps these these conversations have been happening all along the way. So maybe Pohau, I think you probably have a log of some of the questions, so I might pass it over to you to share some of them out, and then our panelists can answer.
Yeah, sure. So I want to ask to our panelists, like considering the extreme and unique environment on the island and the Svalbard Islands, how do you believe these conditions influence both the artistic and scientific practices conducted there? Can you provide more examples from your experience where the environment on Svalbard lead to a significant insight or breakthrough in your work? Right? Yeah, Dr. Cody.
Sure. I can start with a part of the answer, at least for the first portion. So I guess why the environment influences the work that's done in Svalbard. I think just an example from when I was there was seeing at the Artist Collective, one of the artists was working on actually having kids come in and design and make these big floral and plant life, I guess, cutouts and drawings and things. And they basically made this beautiful big garden on a wall. And the reason they were doing that is because a lot of the families that are there are not there. They haven't been there their entire lives. They didn't grow up there. They come from other places, and it's kind of this community of people from all over, and that aren't necessarily used to this environment. And they talked about how when you come to this environment, it's shocking almost that there's no plant life that you're used to there. There's no big trees, there's no big bushes, there's not grass all over the ground. So there's a lot of that plant life that we're used to in a lot of other places in the world. You don't see that in Svalbard. So a lot of the kids there experience this weird feeling of being on an alien planet and not being able to connect with where they are because they don't see this plant life there. So the environment has a huge impact on the families that are there even short term. And so the artists then, this particular artist was working to see how they could kind of bring that connection back in for the kids, and kind of allow them to feel that garden aspect without necessarily having it in their wildlife and being there all the time. And that was, I think, just so interesting for me to think about. I love the desert. I love these landscapes that have no plant life in them. I just think they're absolutely gorgeous, and I love to spend time in them. But I kind of, it made me reconnect to that part of humanity that's like, we're so influenced by nature that when you're in something that's completely different, you feel like you're on an alien world. So that it was really just amazing. And so the environment really had a huge impact on the people that were there.
Thank you, Cody.
I just, sorry, just to interject quickly, I just dropped in the project that Cody was referring to, a future community garden at Arctica Svalbard. So if anyone wants to save the link.
I could speak to how our project was influenced once we landed on the ground. And like every project that has ever been in Svalbard, it requires a lot of pre-planning, a lot of research, a lot of work that has to be done before the expedition or the trip. But I think no matter how thorough you are with your research, you can never quite capture the reality of a place through imagination and through prior research. And so it's important in both like art and science practices to leave that kind of openness or adaptability when you're a visitor to a new place. For us, we had to plan out the different routes and different storylines to our VR game beforehand. So we planned out these different routes, which shot on specific sites. For example, the Global Seed Vault was a really important emblem of Svalbard. Most people who go there have in some way engaged with the Global Seed Vault. It's such a symbol of like hope it's called colloquially the Doomsday Vault, so hope after the apocalypse. And it's become such a defining feature of Svalbard. And so we put a lot of thought, a lot of crafting the narrative and building up storylines around it. And we found that once we went to Svalbard, we were really taken away by other sites that we couldn't even have imagined beforehand. For example, there was this frozen river in the middle of a valley that we discovered with our guide, Lena. And it was during a snowmobile trip, so there was no way that we could have planned it. Lena, with her like really sharp eyes, saw this little glimmer to the right of our route, and she took a big detour. We all went after with her, and we was just completely like taken away by this beautiful frozen river with a huge crack through it, and it was this mesmerizing kind of blue. And immediately on the spot, we wrote up a new storyline. And the challenging thing about working in these so-called extreme environments is all of your like technological apparatuses have to be really adaptable to the environment. Like what Cody said about the batteries, like always having extra batteries because they drain really fast. So whenever you're working with audiovisual equipment, you have to have all these backups. And also, we were in the valley in the snowmobile. It was extremely cold with the wind chill, and we had like liner gloves and like big mittens over it. But to operate machinery, you have to take off the big mittens. but like within 10 seconds of having just the liner and like holding the camera, your hands are numb. So all of these kind of really toiling physical challenges adds to just, I guess, the complexity of working in these environments. But I think it's important to always have that openness to adapt on the spot and really respond to the environment while you're in it, instead of really implementing like your rigid plan that you had so thoughtfully crafted before you arrived. And also being with the community, and because our project really wanted to look at ways of reciprocity with the community. So through these workshops, a lot of planning was done on the ground. And for example, Arctica, the artist residency that Maggie put in the chat just now, they opened up their space for us to conduct our mooncake workshop. And because it's an artistic space, it's not really built for an experimental baking kitchen. We were able to gather all the supplies we need through just the generosity of the community, and we like picked up different things from different people's houses. People really came together to support us and help make this beautiful workshop happen. So like all of these relationships were also just factors that we couldn't really have accounted for beforehand, but really makes up the whole experience.
Thank you, Ray.
I see there's a question in the chat here from Pierre. I can just read it out for whomever. What a wonderful, wonderful world for social engagement with machine in art and science. How do you think the proxy art issue behind the new techniques and media, for example, AR, VR, XR, etc., nowadays influence art and science, the art and science field deeply, especially for visualization speculation?
I think Patrick actually kind of introduced this really nicely, talking about the dinosaur thing of how we're using AI to represent them, and the crossover between how do you manage the factuality of things versus the artistic components of it, and artistic representation. And so I think that, I mean, to me, I think that it's really important that we can show theory in a very visual way. So for us as scientists, we sometimes forget that we talk about, what something looks like. Patrick again said about the data, you can, you see just these charts or kind of very static information. And for us as researchers, we don't even realize we are actually visualizing that in our brains. We can translate that into something very visual because we know the data really well. But how do we communicate that? And you actually need an artist to be able to communicate that information to somebody else. So I think AR, VR, and XR are all things that we can use to communicate a lot of this scientific and research information in a way that people will be able to kind of ingest better. But it doesn't have to be data factual, as in we don't need to show charts. We need to show visual information that translates that. So thinking about it instead of its translation rather than it being non-factual, I think is really important. And it has to be that way because we don't necessarily have all the data to fill in the gaps. We have to fill that in. And the important part then is just to communicate as well what part is artistic and what part is data and fact. So that people can understand this might not be what dinosaurs look like, but here's what we think it could be.
Thanks, Cody. Patrick, do you have anything to add to that since you're working in that space?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's pretty much the things that I said and kind of supporting Cody's point too. I think there are a lot of things that you can do to scientific data to make it more immersive, and it might not be, quote unquote factual, but that's not the point, right? Like, we're not shooting for extreme accuracy. We're shooting for an experience that makes people feel close to what we experience as scientists in these places where we recorded the data, right? And so like another example would be when we're talking about bringing these like high definition 360-degree cameras to the space and like projecting that for the application of projecting that into VR space. So these cameras are expensive. We actually had a cheaper version of one that we took with us to Svalbard, and they're heavy, and we had to carry it, an hour and a half up a glacier, and it was a lot of work. But when we're trying to think about this problem of accuracy and immersion or designing an experience, we could leverage AI for that. Now, I'm not going to say that we should use AI for everything. I disagree with that. But I do think that there are tools that are being developed that can aid us. For instance, AI upscaling. We could take a camera that might not be 816 32K, like high definition for like the Dome in Las Vegas, but we could take a lower resolution camera that's lighter, that can last longer, that's just better for a variety of reasons, and then bring that back, AI upscale the imagery to design an experience. So therefore, it's not necessarily pixel accurate to the scene that we're recording, but it's accurate enough to make people feel as if they're there, to get them most of the way there without actually having to hop on a plane and go all the way to Svalbard or wherever. So I think there's a lot of value in these tools. But there's a lot more that can be done, right? Because like you could see Svalbard in like a VR, XR, AR, all the R's. But there's more to Svalbard than just that. There's like the smells of Svalbard, for instance, right? There's experiencing it over a long duration, especially in the summer months when the sun doesn't set and you could go mad, where it's like 4 a.m. and you think it's noon. So I think like, and I think we're going to see more and more of this as AR, VR, XR devices become more of a commodity. So it's really exciting stuff.
In our sorry, Maggie.
No, go ahead.
I just wanted to follow up with our project, which also uses VR and the game engine. The main reasons we wanted to have to work in these platforms is the idea of embodiment and also the idea of agency on the part of the audience member to have a choice and to navigate a space on their own pace and their own time. And the structure of a game also really responds to our project on time and different kinds of temporalities. It's basically set up for nonlinear time and nonlinear ways to experience time. And I think it's, for us, VR is a really powerful storytelling tool, and storytelling we think has a value within these narratives that science might not have the capacity to respond to. When we were at Svalbard, we talked to many different individuals, scientists who work at UNIS, the University Center in Svalbard, and often we hear about these kind of climate anxiety or climate grief that comes with making science, and that cannot really be addressed in science when you are treating a place as an object for scientific data. There's no space that allows for you to process these emotions. And I think through art and through aesthetic expressions, we can make that space within the container of storytelling. We can make a space to process the grief. We can also make a space to collectively imagine the future, to open up new spaces, to think of different ways to care or dream or hope for the future. And art can also, like, storytelling can also be a provocation. It doesn't just have to cradle the audience. It can also provide like embodied provocations about a place and about certain ideologies or imaginaries. So yeah, I don't know if Nancy has something to add.
I think my internet's going in and out, so sorry if I'm like kind of like off to the side, but no, I did think that utilizing, I guess, like these, I guess, like formats for experimentation, I think, yeah, they seem to open up new possibilities for us. And I think one thing, you know, that was, I think for us kind of was also to hear from the ground, I guess, like the work that people you know, are doing at places like UNIS is to really kind of get an insight into how people deal with, maybe, yeah, climate grief and anxiety, as you mentioned, Ray. And so that ability, I guess, to kind of like create a bridge where people can express the deeply emotional and pretty like big weight that is carried by scientists who are working and experiencing, I guess, like in some ways, like before climate research, the grief, you know, that comes along with like seeing, you know, climate change happen in real time, and it's like Svalbard, but it's so much more visible. What is like an outlet, you know, for that kind of like emotion? What is an anthropology of that experience, right, as well? And so in many ways, we were trying to like find these stories and more like kind of embodied experience of place and this phenomenon that, you know, we're kind of calling climate grief. And I think we were very grateful to, you know, the people who made time to share experience with us. And so I do think that it's also important to make space for those kinds of conversations in both like the arts and the sciences. And yeah, that's all I have to add.
Thanks, Nancy. There was an audience question that I think relates to what you and Ray just mentioned. I'm now just scrolling for it. It says, yes, what are your views regarding the carbon footprint of doing research and artwork like these? And that's a question for anybody.
I guess I could chime in, but you know, I think kind of going back to what we were saying earlier of designing these experiences, that's fundamentally to reduce the footprint, right? Like we want people to experience it and to create an experience that's very close to what we experience physically in Svalbard without them actually having to go there. I think the problem is that the carbon footprint for something like this is a bit ambiguous. Because if you think about Svalbard, for instance, there's also a lot of cruise vessels that kind of go through that space too. So that kind of adds to things. There's a lot of tourism as well, not throughout the whole of Svalbard, but just like through Longyearbyen and kind of around. So it's a bit difficult to kind of answer that. And I also saw that in Patagonia. So when we were in these very remote regions where it's really hard to get to, like from the US, it takes 3 flights to get there, and then you have to take a ferry an hour to get to this one place, and then you have to hike up. But there you still see tourists kind of walk through that space too. So I think we're not going to stop tourism, but from a scientific perspective, I think our, at least for these specific applications, our carbon footprint is relatively low. And what we're trying to do is bring, at least in my case, bring as much technology with us as possible so we could properly record everything that we can, acoustics, imagery, you know, eventually maybe smells and other dimensions of sensation to kind of reduce the need of people wanting to go travel and see these places. But tourism aside, you know, I think the scientific footprint for some of these things is relatively low.
Just building on that, my work actually started out just being a space topic, and going to Svalbard made me think about this question of the carbon footprint and how we, like Patrick is saying, how we allow people to visit these places without bringing in a whole lot of tourists and bringing in a lot of people, and how we could use the VR kind of technology that I was using just for space, how we could use that for fragile environments on Earth to kind of allow people to see these places without having to go there. And I think having a lot of artists in these locations is also important because it builds out that experiential kind of portion of being able to be in these places, because they kind of hit on the emotions that you feel when you're there, and more than just kind of like, here are the facts of what's in this location. So I think you need to have a few people in these places and then allow the rest of the world to experience it through their eyes to reduce carbon footprint, just by saying, you know, you don't have to be in the location. You can still experience it through these other developments that people like the artists there or the work that we're doing hopefully will create for people.
Thanks, Cody. A question here from Sean. As an interdisciplinary artist and magician, I'm curious about the role of performing arts in Svalbard. What are the possibilities for conducting research using performing arts or in space and beyond? Cody, you might have some examples of this from the zero gravity flight, and any examples.
I can start, but others, please feel free to jump in. Just on the, so the first one, I met an artist when we were there who does performative art, and he did some really interesting videos that were in Svalbard. I can't remember the exact way, like the way that this was built up, but he was at the time doing a project where he was pushing some large barrel or something very, very big across a very open landscape of snow and rock and things. And I think he was like minimally dressed, so it was very, very cold. It was so interesting to hear about this performance artist working in Svalbard. So definitely possibilities to do that there. Thanks, Maggie.
Yeah, Stein Henningsen. And actually, you just reminded me, Cody, I don't know if it's when it will run again, but Stein has actually organized an amazing performance arts festival in Svalbard. So yeah, please look up his work and maybe reach out and express your interest.
Yeah, so definitely opportunity to do that in Svalbard. And in space, it's not as common for actual in-space activities to have performance artists, but hopefully that'll be something in the future that does happen. As part of our initiative, we run parabolic flights every year, and we try to include performance artists in the work that we do, because working in microgravity is definitely an artist platform. It's very unique, something that is mind-changing when you get to do it. So we involve performance artists for that.
How actually, not to put you on the spot, but since you have also participated in Cody's one of Cody's zero gravity flights as an artist, which was somewhat performative, do you have any thoughts on that in a space or extreme environments context?
Yeah, I did a performative project that I built more like an instrument for zero gravity flight, and I was considering about space junk. So I tried to use like industrial waste to create an instrument like shaker or a rain stick, but in the weightless environment. And for me, I haven't really got the chance to go to Arctic area like Svalbard Island, but I can imagine that really step into Arctic environment, the embodied experience will change a lot, from like considering the climate change in your own place. And yeah, so back to today's topic, I really want to hear our panelists to share how they build up their methodology, because if you really want to respond to a scientific issue or questions, and you want to integrate your practice with sensor, some kind of like environmental monitoring devices, and you got data, then you will need to have a methodology to analyze, to treat your observation and to find the pattern. But build artistic methodology can be very different from scientific methodology. So yeah, yeah. So I really want to hear your insights and experience.
So I can speak a little bit about building up the different methodologies and the different technologies that we use. Originally, the project that I was doing, we just started with a 3D camera, and we actually did testing in Massachusetts in different areas outdoors as well, kind of looking at the different cameras that we wanted to use and figuring out what exactly we wanted to display using these cameras so that we could kind of narrow down to the right one. So I think from a technological standpoint, you're kind of always thinking about what are the end results? How do you want to actually pick the, what is the process to pick your technology based on your end result? We then started to build out other components of this. We brought in environmental sensors. And as Maggie kind of mentioned, we started doing sketches so that we could have hand notes as well, so that we could come back to that when we were designing this virtual environment, making sure it's complete. So that's, you know, the methodology from the technology side is thinking about the end result, and then how do you pick the different sensors and technologies to build that. But then in the field, the methodology is a little more creative and adaptive. So we come up with these concepts of operations before we go out into the field, very precise, like here's what we're going to do. You want to put flags down and then measure and then, you know, do all these things. But once you get into the field, the methodology actually a little bit goes out the window. You're prepared with something in advance, but then when you get out there, and I think Nancy and Ray kind of touched on this, that you have to be adaptive because the environment has a big impact on your methods. So once we got out there, we had to adapt a little bit these operations of how we actually conducted the research and kind of develop that through the entire process. But then that fed back into, it's kind of this big cycle. It fed back into what we're now going to do on the moon because it informed the methodology that we want to use on the lunar surface based on what we did in Svalbard. So everything kind of is this iterative process of trial and error and kind of building your methodology as you go.
Thank you, Cody. And Maggie, maybe we can invite our audience to raise their hand if they got any questions.
Please do. I've been trying my best to follow along with the chat, so feel free to either type it in or raise your hand, as Poha said, and even just share your speak out. Oh, here we have one. Maybe it's a comment. I'll just read it. From my personal experience, it is sometimes more difficult to invite scientists who already have their own core research themes to join such a cross-field project involving field research than to invite artists. I would like to ask how you invite scientists or academic researchers to join this kind of program. How can collaborations actually realized, and what are the necessary resources needed, or maybe specific funding? That's a very good question. And funding is a real and practical challenge that we all face in our various fields. Anyone want to go for that?
I'm happy to if nobody wants to jump in again. Because Maggie and I, actually Maggie, you could probably answer this question really well. So I think having really diverse teams, especially when you're trying to combine artists and scientists, you're right. It is hard to invite researchers in who have a very strict idea of what it is they want to do, what data they want to collect, and they kind of, there's a lack of flexibility, whereas artists, it's a lot more fluid. And Patrick kind of talked about this on his trip, where the artists were just, you know, they were there to experience and to inform their projects based on the experience, whereas the researchers went in with like this strict outline of like, here's what we got to do and we got to get to these places. And on my trip, we found that too, like there was some kind of back and forth of like, no, we have to go to my field site, or no, it's my field site day. Like we have to go over here because the weather's just right. And so even having too many scientists was really difficult because they were so specific about it. And so I think having the conversations ahead of time to let the researchers know that being in the field must be a flexible experience, even beyond just working with artists, but even the fact that you're going to have environmental conditions that don't suit you every day, and you're going to have your field site that you picked out ahead of time might not be the right one. So making sure that they know ahead of time that they need to be very flexible, and that whatever they put together might completely go out the window, and that whatever data they collect might not actually work out. And so just to prepare them for what a researcher would almost feel like was failure, and to let them know that they can kind of build on that. And having them work with artists, I think, really helps. For the funding portion of this question, funding is always a challenge. And I think, Patrick, again, I'm pulling on a lot of your previous answers, but you talked about how you have to frame things for your audience. And so sometimes you'll have expeditions that are very, very strictly scientific. And so you want to frame even the artist's work as having artistic relevance, or sorry, scientific relevance, so that the funding can come through for both types of researchers, whether they're artists or scientists. And so the most recent trip that Maggie coordinated for us in the Canary Islands, we did have both artists and scientists, but our funders were very specifically interested in science. And so we found a thread that connected the artist's work to the scientific endeavor to make sure that we could actually have him there, because his contribution was massive and really impacted a lot of the work. And so it was really important that we had him there. But we had to kind of find that scientific thread to make sure that the funding could apply to his work as well.
Thanks, Cody. That's such a good point about finding these strategic ways to, fulfill those objectives while also bringing others' work. I had a question for Ray and Nancy that I think is related, and then Pierre, I see yours in the comments there, which is not just about funding, but just ways to access spaces, whether it's scientific spaces, artistic institutions, from a researcher's perspective. Svalbard is a very specific example, but if you have others where you've worked, it would be interesting to hear about how that came about.
I'd like to actually jump in. Can you let me know if the sound is a little choppy? But I mean, I don't know if maybe this, I would like to actually turn the question a little bit towards you, Maggie, because the reason why our, I think, experience in Svalbard was so incredible, and I think I'm speaking for some of the other team members in this panel, why our experience was so incredible and facilitated by, someone who's brain and rhizomatic kind of mind works, is because of people like you. And for everyone who's, in the audience, just Maggie was oftentimes the logistician and the facilitator for a lot of, the research that was being done in Svalbard. And I actually think that the resource that, makes things like this possible is to have mediators, or people who are able to be bridges, between these two fields. And I think that, Maggie, you've shown us time and time again that that is the thing that is important and necessary. It's the people who are able to create these, bridges that are oftentimes not really recognized, or not necessarily made as visible by the fields, the specificity of the fields, right? And so I actually do think that this kind of third space that's nebulous, hybrid, and a little bit murky is the most important one, because it's the reason why, people like us who have no we don't necessarily have any kind of scientific background, are able to establish and create relationships with, people who do. And I actually don't necessarily think that this is something that is like a prescriptive method. I think it comes also from just you being someone who has like an extremely generous spirit and, you know, kind of like openness that it's important to make things like this happen. So I think that that is the magic. And maybe, Pierre, this answers your like question about the enchantment is you need magicians to create this other glue or cohesion that might not exist otherwise.
Well, thank you, Nancy, for that very generous response. And to now also pass it back to all of you, I think something that you all recognized in your work is the importance of the reciprocal relationship of all research, and that applies to all disciplines. So not just going into a community for your own project, which sometimes does need to happen if you need results quickly, but being able to offer workshops, your time for exchange of ideas, sharing your work. It can be as simple as going to a place and just with your computer or maybe some postcards that you printed. I have some other artist friends here who, you know, share their work in this way. I think is also really important, and that just like fostering those relationships can go a long way to open up opportunities. And it sounds quite simplistic, but that has been my experiencing and accessing different spaces, especially in a place like Svalbard, and also when Cody and I were recently in Lanzarote, which also happens to be within an archipelago as an island community. So maybe this is specific to the island life, where everyone is sort of a here and now kind of situation where exchange can be possible, and through these relationships, getting invited out onto different expeditions and trips, and it just becomes more of a natural process. But I think, yeah, following the lead of at least Nancy and Ray most recently in Svalbard, who facilitated multiple workshops for the community that was so very much appreciated, is a really excellent way to be able to access spaces, as Pierre, you're asking. I think to create that enchantment and wonder in your own work is through curating these kinds of events. That could be one possible strategy that's mutually beneficial. Oh, someone asked a question about, I'm a student studying sociology and art, interested in Arctic culture. Is there any chance to participate in projects in Svalbard? I dropped a link here for the Svalbard Social Science Initiative, which has, it's a network of social scientists, I think mostly independent, but there could also be some links to their organizations who are doing that kind of type of work there. So that could be a good resource for you to connect with. We've had all sorts of people studying from it through an anthropological lens, for example, the research station model, or the relationship of wildlife and humans, various other historical aspects of the community in Svalbard, and they've done quite successful work. But I can't necessarily speak as much to how they've accessed those spaces, but I think all of us incorporate these different fields into our own thinking. So I think if you just found specific individuals or groups like Cody's who are kind of engaged in thinking holistically about these topics, there's absolutely room for all those fields.
One of the researchers that was on the trip that I was on in Svalbard, actually, that was specifically what she was researching, both looking at us as the researchers in that environment and how we were impacted by being in that environment for the, just under 2-week trip. But then also trying to interview some of the community members and thinking about, the community life that had been built up in Svalbard. So she was doing research like that.
I just dropped their name into the chat. Sana Sharma. She was also doing a really exciting astronaut ethnography research with Cody's group that was related to the Svalbard work.
And actually, that work is still ongoing. So if we can reach out to me or Sana, she is looking for people to work with her on that. So people who are interested in working on that, it's ongoing.
Oh, a question from our good friend Domi in Svalbard. Do you plan to make more meetings like the one today. I guess that's possibly for POHA, but maybe Cody, you'll initiate something on the SEI side as well for this kind of discussion.
I would love to. Absolutely, I would love to. Yeah, any opportunities. I think this is a really great way to talk about our work and highlight the amazing place that Svalbard is.
Yeah, I hope we can conduct more meeting or gathering like this. And like I mentioned, this event supported by Taiwan National Science and Technology Council. And it's not very common that they support art events. So if you are interested in this kind of discussion, please come to our future events or come to see the exhibition. And if we got very positive responses from from our audience, and then we might have got a chance to host more events like this.
As Ray mentioned earlier, we're a group of artists and researchers who meet in extreme environments. So we could perhaps continue a theme of exploring these kinds of projects in different sites. Has here, hi. Thanks for all the inspiration. As a multidisciplinary artist and spatial designer, I am curious about whether these artistic practices are having ductility to local common culture, for example.
Sorry, I was looking for the definition of the word.
Appreciate. I'm learning now.
Thank you so much, Paz, for that question. I like to think that it does. In some ways, I think that at least art practices in some way like allow some of these more like obscure, I guess, like knowledge to become more vernacular or more accessible, I think, to like other kinds of audiences. I guess like one way in which for at least me and Ray, this might happen is we're both educators and we teach. And so a lot of the work that we're doing, and doing these projects and, this kind of work definitely bleeds into the work that we're doing into as educators in our pedagogy as well. It becomes influenced by, all of the work that, is also shaping our work in many ways. And so I like to think that some of these ideas are porous and seeping into, I guess, like other aspects of common culture. But I do think that it takes time, and it's something that, sometimes art is not the most accessible, or it doesn't necessarily make itself as legible for more broader audiences, and I definitely think that that's like one of our goals and one of our aims is to try to make our work more open and more less obscure, but it's a work in progress. I don't know.
Maggie, maybe I can kind of bring this back to Svalbard a little bit. So thinking about how this impacts like local culture, did you see any impacts from having scientists like us and researchers like us? I know a lot of the community is people like that, but did you see that the really temporary ones that were just coming in and doing short-term projects, did that have an impact on the longer-term people like you and like the people who had been there for many years? What was kind of the influence on that local culture?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that is very much just the fabric of Svalbard. People have lived there, sort of what is defined as long-term or short-term resident, visitors. In many ways, all people are visitors there. So this is a discussion point, and for some, a point of tension. Can be a fatigue of the artist, researcher, scientist, tourist, whomever, coming in and out, but also that creates this huge sort of cultural input that is just, absolutely the tapestry of the place. So for me, it's what made the place so special and vibrant. For others, it can be challenging, saying goodbye to friends often, or not even having the capacity to make new friends in a given moment. So I think that's just the nature. That just is, for me, that is Svalbard. But I'm only one person, so there's probably a huge variety of perspectives there. And then there isn't even just one defining culture. There are so many micro communities within the space. I was always working and living within this very interdisciplinary space, so that was something that I was welcoming into my version of the culture of Svalbard. Yeah, I hope, did that answer your question a little bit? Yeah. We have, I think, just around 10 minutes if anybody wants to chime in with any other questions. Dami, just to follow up on, I don't know if you're still here, I can't see the full audience, but asking about more meetings like this, I would be curious to hear from others if there's specific topics, whether it's Svalbard focused or just more about interdisciplinary work, what would be interesting to engage in, or what other kinds of resources aside from a meeting point like this and Pohau's wonderful physical exhibition could be interesting, whether it's a website or just like different ways to connect with, like, who are the people out there in the world who are open to pursuing this kind of work, whether it's through collaboration or, in my part, trying to facilitate some of the logistics and production side of it to create these meetings. And maybe Pohau, if you do send out the follow-up, that's something that we could crowdsource a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm sending out the exhibition info. And yeah, if you got any question to, like, for specific project or our speakers, please raise your hand. It's a unique chance that we can have the chance, like, this environment to talk and exchange ideas. And we also got English exhibition page.
I guess maybe to follow up a little bit on that question, this isn't like a specific resource, but I guess more just directed towards people who are just interested in this kind of like hybrid approach or hybrid field. I actually think that like even like looking into local maybe like universities and seeing if they have like any kind of pre-established artist programs, or even just like going to like lectures in fields in which you're interested, and starting by like meeting people or approaching, I guess, like folks whose work is interesting to you. Even just like beginning, I think, kind of like, yeah, locally in your own town, and seeing if there's any kind of like practitioners or fields that you're interested in. I think it's starting by maybe building those relationships there, even like locally, I think is really helpful. And I do think that, you know, we talk a lot about like these kind of collaborations between art and science, and it's like, what does that actually look like? And I guess just like looking back, sometimes they just happen as conversations. And sometimes it's like, you know, people that maybe you might stumble upon somewhere in a bar and you end up having a drink with, and, you know, their ideas and your ideas kind of have a synergy, and then something happens. And so I think it's maybe going out of our way in our comfort zone in our respective fields to, you know, as you know, was mentioned earlier, to kind of try to create those bridges, I think is the nitty-gritty work, I guess, of the collaboration often just happens like that through conversations and, I guess, just being near each other. And so, yeah, but I don't know.
Maybe on the same subject of accessing spaces, for someone that doesn't already exist in the network or have those connections, it may be very daunting to even imagine how you can reach out to someone. And from my personal experience, I would say, like, cold emailing has been very successful for me. I wouldn't have engaged with SEI at all if it were not for that cold email I sent to Ariel years ago. Ariel is the previous director of MIT SEI. When I was a student at MIT ACT, a different program, I heard about this opportunity to take part in a microgravity flight for research. And back during the time when I was there, this resource was not available for everyone because it is a very exclusive opportunity. So I cold emailed Ariel writing about, I think I wrote her email about the role of artists and storytellers in this space, like that she aims to create. I think the mission was democratizing access to space. And so I made a plea for the importance of artists and creative practitioners in that space. And over the years, if you're interested in something and you do your research and you see contacts for people, I would say don't be shy, just to send them an email, introduce yourself. The worst case that could happen is no response, which isn't really any loss on your part. So if you find yourself at a place where you don't have the connections or not inside the network, reach out to people.
That's very encouraging. And sometimes, yeah, it is that's simple, not so simple thing of sending the email just to make the introduction. But I guess for the scientists entering the art space, I'll use Patrick's sound room as an example because it's a physical object, so it can be a bit easier to visualize. But that's something that started out as an engineering challenge to fill the need for a National Geographic Explorer in these various contexts. And then it had all of these other outcomes, which were just how to share the sound. And then now in POHAU's exhibition, Convergence, just the simple recontextualization of placing that object in a more museum exhibition context, it already becomes an art piece. And there's so many scientists collecting data, whether it's sound-based or audio, that it might not even require the artist's translation. It might not even require this full collaborative effort with additional funding and time, but actually just putting it in a different place. So now we're listening to glacial noise or underwater noise in a museum, and already it has a different effect than if you were to listen to it as traditional scientific data or see it as a graph. So for the scientists to maybe reach out to other curators and POHAU to see how they can position their work.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of value in like scientists reaching out to other artists to see how they could use their data or everything they collected for an exhibition or just for anything. I feel like there's not a whole lot of that happening. If anything, there might be artists reaching out to engineers or other scientists because they think their work is interesting, but not so much the other way around. And that's kind of what happens organically at the Media Lab. Like, for instance, if I do a presentation, there might be a couple of artists in the audience. They'll come up to me after and say they want to use my data for some kind of for some kind of like installation or kind of experience. And like one of them was there's a sound artist at the lab who used my Svalbard data to create this very like generative alien kind of sounding experience where it took the natural data, and as you listen to it, it slowly started evolving into this like outer worldly kind of experience. And I thought that was really fascinating.
We need more people like you, Patrick.
I don't know about that, but yeah.
Just a few minutes left, but POHAU, do you have any or anybody have any closing comments? And just to have, as a reminder that there's lots of good stuff and links in the chat. So if anybody wants to just do a big copy paste before we close the call.
Yeah, we will do like we will publish an article about this event. So we might include all the links in that article, but maybe it takes like a week. Yeah. So yeah, and all the information will be published through NAR Labs. Yeah, it's our host organization. I will also pass their link. Maybe so this is our host organization. And you can maybe follow their Instagram or Facebook. If there's no question, then thank you all for participating in this discussion. I'm really grateful to our panelists for sharing all these valuable experiences and insights. So our special thanks to Maggie, our moderator, and our panelists, Dr. Cody, Patrick, Ray, and Nancy. And I also want to thank our audience for you to stay till the end of this discussion. And also thank you for your thoughtful questions. Yeah, and if you haven't visited the exhibition yet, please remember that it is open from Monday to Friday during the daytime at the Technology Building in Taipei. Additionally, we have many more exciting events planned in collaboration with the Co-Evolution Research Assembly. For instance, tomorrow at the Technology Building, we will have a film screening on creating a musical piece inspired by Formosa satellites produced by the Taiwan Space Agency, and followed by a guided listening session and discussion. So once again, thank you all for joining us. Have a wonderful evening, and we look forward to seeing you at our next event. Thank you.
And thank you, Poha, and the whole team who helped put this together. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.